Next up, I don't think he needs much of an introduction, but I'm super happy to welcome Charles Hoskinson to the stage, and he's going to be speaking about Cardano and the future of blockchain. So please give it up for Charles.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to have some chairs up here in just a little bit because I think they gave me an hour, which means I can talk a little bit about what I do and what we're doing with Book.io. But more importantly, you guys want to hear about my book? It's a book conference, right? And actually, the co-author is here, and the principal author, Mark Junge, and he'll be coming up in just a moment. And we'll have a chance to talk about the history of Wyoming, specifically the history of my ranch in Wyoming. How about that? So this is an exciting time to be alive because I now get to witness all these amazing projects building on blockchain infrastructure across the world. And it doesn't really matter what chains you're on. What matters is the philosophy and principles behind the things that you build. This idea that as a producer, you own the fruits of your labors. It's kind of a simple thing, right? And unfortunately, when you look at most industries for creatives, whether it be writing a book or creating music or creating movies, what have you, usually you don't own the fruits of your labors. There's these middlemen that come in, they take all the value out of the transaction. You end up getting a few percentage points, you do all the work. And what they do is they leverage the fact that they own the channels and the customers to control and sculpt markets. This hurts us in three different dimensions. The first is it overall reduces the amount of money you make as a creative. Sucks. Number two, it reduces the overall level of creativity of the media. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what you want to say, what you want to create. It's what the people who control those channels tell you is popular. So if you have something that's not, according to them, popular or interesting, you're not allowed to actually distribute, or you get muted in some way. What does that mean? You end up getting these very fragile, highly optimized monocultures, and that translates to the same music being made again and again and again, the same books being written again and again and again, the same content. Does that make us better? Does that make us stronger? Does that make us smarter? No, ultimately it hurts us as a society. And the third thing is censorship. When you start handing the power of an ecosystem to a small group of actors, they may be virtuous in the beginning, but the arc of human history always shows you that power corrupts. And if you give people the power of the printing press, you give people the power of media, give people the power of truth, in the long run, they're going to co-opt that for their own ends. Perhaps their own ends are political, perhaps their own ends are enrichment, perhaps their own ends are just power. It doesn't particularly matter what the ends are. They're not society's ends. They're not your ends. So why should we contribute to systems that promote this? And publishing books, knowledge, these things, it's one of the most important industries in human history. This is how we inspire people. This is how we get better. This is how we teach people new things. So it's incredibly important that the tools that we have as a society for publishing, for the ability to bring content to people, are built in as open a way as possible, where the people who buy it own it, and the people who produce it, they're treated fairly. It's a simple and a basic thing. I've been to 73 countries. I've traveled all around the world the last 12 years. And one of the simple truths that I've learned is if for some reason it doesn't make sense, it's because somebody's making money. There's a lot in life these days that doesn't make sense. Cost of healthcare, how education works, how politics work, how the media works, how simple solutions could easily be implemented to solve a lot of problems in society, but for some reason we just don't do it. It's because somebody's making money. So if you're going to win the game, you have to change the rules of the game. You can't go and beg publishers be nice, honest people. You can't go and take all these big media companies and say, hey, could you just treat us fairly for once? How's that ever worked out for you? Go to your bank and say, hey, JP Morgan, I need you to do this for me. It's like, I'm sorry, not going to happen. So what you do is you just change it, and that's what Book has done, and that's what the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem has done. They didn't ask for permission, they just built a really cool and interesting model, and they built it in the right place, Texas, come on. Don't ask permission here in Texas, you just get it done. And they brought a lot of great people together, especially here today. So I first want to thank them so much for their hospitality and inviting me to come on down. And I made a commitment about 6 months ago. I said if I ever wrote a book, I would publish first on book. So Mark is a historian, and I'll give you a little bit of a backstory, and then we'll have a nice Q&A. Yeah, take a seat. And this is totally impromptu. We didn't tell him we were going to do this. So Mark's a historian, and he's based in Wyoming. And when I bought my ranch back in 2021, I said, it'd be really cool to learn about the history of it. And unfortunately, no one had written a book about it. No one had really, aggregated all that information. We just had oral lore. So what do when you got a ranch, you got a pile of money? You hire a historian, and you say, hey, write a book. So I think we talked first about the project in, was it 2021 in like September, October, somewhere there?
Right.
So why don't you tell them a little bit about your background and some of the books you've written, some of the research you've done?
Well, I've combined history with photography. Excuse me?
A little closer.
A little closer. I've combined history with photography, but particularly relating to Wyoming, because I was a state bureaucrat. I was in a historic preservation office, and my job was to preserve historic buildings such as this one, get them on the National Register, and to do that you had to write an essay, and you had to find the coordinates on a map, and you had to take pictures. So history and photography have always been combined for me. So I started writing books, and it was a hassle because as a state employee, you have to beg for stuff. I don't know if you know that or not, but you have to beg for stuff and say, please, I need a lens for this 4x5 camera, which is a documentary camera, and we got to have it. And well, you have to talk to the accountant. So you go to the accountant, and the accountant says, well, why do you really need this? I mean, is it something you actually have to have, and can you ask for it in the next biennial budget? No, we need a document now. So I was frustrated by I think it's a miracle that I was able to get any books done somewhere on my own time. But when Charles called and said, or William called, his brother William, and said, how'd you like to do a study, a historical study? I went, okay. And I knew that country just a little bit. I know a lot more about it now. And it relates to Texas, too, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if I don't want to go too much more into my past because it's kind of sketchy. No, I'm just.
So we used to smuggle drugs together back in the day. That's how we met him.
So
the movie The Mule was based on him. Clint Eastwood did a great job. But no. So start a little bit though. You're a historian by training, and what are some of the books you've written before this project?
Well, I started out with a guide to historic sites. My boss wanted it done, and it was nice that he suggested that because that was right up my alley. So I did a book on historic sites in Wyoming. And then I did a book on a photographer, J.E. Stimson, who took pictures all along the Union Pacific. When Harriman bought the Union Pacific, it was really run down. And he wanted to rebuild and have double track clear across the United States. So he hired a photographer, Stimson, and said, you can take pictures of anything you want to take, and you can sell them, but I want pictures of this, this, and this. So he did that, and I did a book on his photography, which is wonderful black and white photography. He used an 8x10 camera, and he composed excellently. I mean, the pictures are just gorgeous. And then I did a book, Pictorial History of Wyoming, which was just text and pictures, text and pictures. And then I did a book on, it was called The Wind is My Witness. And what I did was, in my tenure as a state employee, I had been all over the state talking to people, and I knew there was a rich treasure in the state of just people, and there's personal stories. And I talked to them, and I thought, we ought to do a book on the people of the state, sort of cut through the population, from waitresses and people that make beds in hotels, all the way up to bank presidents and governors. And I said, I wasn't sure what it was, so I went to a sociologist at the University of Wyoming and I said, what am I trying to do? And he says, I think you're trying to come up with a Wyoming ethos. And I said, okay, that's what I'm doing. So I went out and interviewed 400 or 500 people around the state, took their pictures, had a photographer with me who was excellent, and he took a lot of those pictures. But we sat down and did 1.5 to 2 hour interviews, and sometimes even more, depending on the personality. Well, a lot of those people are gone. They're just flat gone. And I figured people would dig out their interviews from the archives and listen to them and listen to their stories, especially their families. But I was surprised that every once in a while people would say, yeah, you did my grandfather. Yeah, you did so-and-so. Well, I was hoping that you people would understand that this is important to your personal history. But not everybody looks at it that way. Yeah, they appreciate history, but do they really appreciate history and all the factors that lead to the development of what you've got here, for example? So then I did that book. Then I did a book on another photographer in Casper who also was very, very good. And those are both black and white books. So, and I did a book for my granddaughter. I did some freelance photography, and so I shot pictures of entertainers, like Stevie Wonder and Elton John, and I had a press pass, so that allowed me to do this kind of stuff. So I got into a lot of things, and let's see, where was I going with this? I have no idea.
We're just walking through the history so people know who you are.
So anyway, the sixth book was a book for my daughter. The Bolshoi came to Cheyenne, Wyoming, believe it or not, and performed the Bolshoi. They had to make a stop somewhere, and I guess that was a good place to stop, so they put on a performance, and I shot a lot of pictures of the Bolshoi. And I took the pictures and put them in a book and described the movements that the balletist or ballet artist were doing. And then I'd say A is for such and such, B is for such and such. She was just a little girl. So we have pictures, plus there's a real cute picture of her that my son took. My son's a documentary filmmaker, and he took a great picture of her. Anyway, that's the sixth book.
So then we get to 2021, and my brother calls you, and he says, hey, there's this crazy guy just bought a ranch, and we're trying to figure out the history of it. So how do you go about starting a project like that? What goes into researching a historical project? What are the foundations of
Well,
it?
you just go down rabbit holes. You just start digging. I mean, there's some general sources. You go to history books like the History of Wyoming. There's other sources. You can go to the library. You can go to the state archives, and you can look this stuff up. Now, of course, I can sit behind my computer and just bring this stuff up. And with AI, we'll be able to rewrite the book.
We'll get to that in a second. We got about 330 pages. We're there.
But, I think it's interesting that Charles is the first person I know who actually instigated professional studies of his ranch. In all my years in state bureaucracy, I never had heard of any rancher that was so interested in his ranch that he had studies done on it. He hired a professional geologist, professional archaeologist, a plant biologist, an animal biologist. And then his brother called me up and said, do you want to do a history? And I went, finally, yeah, I'll do a history. So that's how the thing started. And I dug in right away without pay because I loved what I was doing. You people know how that is. You love what you're doing. It's not work if you love it. So anyway, we started in September 2021, and I was to do the historical study. But I think it's kind of interesting, the ties to Texas. That ranch was owned early on during the open range cattle industry when they drove tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of cattle up from Texas. And the cowboys that drove them up, in some cases, became foremen for the ranches. So this ranch, the Twin Pine Ranch, was but really lived in and developed by people who came up from Texas. And in fact, I've written a book about it. One guy who settled on the ranch had a brother who lived on an adjoining ranch, and he wrote a book called North from Texas, which is fascinating because it talks about the trail drives and what have you. So there's a Texas connection. And then there's another Texas connection in that two Harvard boys came out to Wyoming, and their classmate was Teddy Roosevelt. They came out to Wyoming. They hunted on the ranch. They fell in love with the West. I mean, they were these young guys from the East Coast, and they thought, the West, go West, young man. So they did, and they hunted on the ranch and fell in love with the area. But then I think they saw the opportunity. He saw the opportunity for making money. And so I think his father, Teschemacher's father, it was Hubert Teschemacher and his partner Frederick de Billier. They came out as classmates, and their other classmate, Teddy Roosevelt, his father gave him $10,000, which in today's money would be worth about $300,000 as an investment. So Teschemacher becomes very important in local politics. He's a member of the Stock Growers Association, which is the rule. That's who rules Wyoming at that time in the 1880s. He becomes a member of that. He becomes an officer. The Cheyenne Club, where all the big shots hung out and did their thing, he was on their board. He was a member of the Board of Trustees on the Stock Growers National Bank. He was elected to the legislature, and guess what? He was appointed to the Livestock Commission. So you can see how if you can get into the legislature and you can mix and mingle with people that are important, you can get some things done. And surprisingly, one of the things he did was the governor asked him to help write the state constitution. Wyoming became a state in 1890, and they came in with women's suffrage, the first state to do so. So he works on the committee on women's suffrage. He works on irrigation, which is critical to any ranch. But he's in the prime of the industry. He senses that something's happening. He senses that this is not going to last for some reason. And in 1886-87, a storm hit, the worst storm in the Northern High Plains history, and it wiped out, in some cases, 80% of the herds. I mean, it snowed early, and then it melted and froze, so the cattle couldn't get to the grass. And then it snowed again and piled on top of that, and there were cattle lying in heaps in the ditches and up against fences trying to get away from the cold. And so a lot of guys went out of business right there. Well, it's funny how they go from our problem is nature, and we need to do more about irrigating hay fields in order to supply hay and grass for these animals. The problem went from that to blaming the small cattlemen who were absconding with some of their calves, called mavericks, and they didn't like it. And they didn't like it so much, and they thought that was their problem, that they organized a group called the Invaders. And guess what? They hired about 25, 30 Texas gunmen. And Texas gunmen came up, and they supplied them with arms and horses. And they were going to go up, and they had a dead list of 70 people that they were going to kill up in Johnson County. And they were just going to murder them. And they were rustlers, and they deserved to die. And the judges weren't prosecuting these guys, or they weren't prosecuting these guys. They were getting away with taking my calves, right? Well, one of the things that you have to think about is that the small guy couldn't take his calves to auction, couldn't take them to the roundups because he was not a member of the WSGA, Wyoming Stock Growers Association. So he was effectively kept out by these guys. Well, these guys are terribly distressed about the cattle they're losing, the calves they're losing, the mavericks they're losing. So they organized this group, the Texas gunmen, along with Teschemacher and de Billier, went up, and they killed two rustlers. They were also trappers. They killed two rustlers in their cabin, burnt the cabin down. The guy comes out of the cabin, and they shoot him down in cold blood, and they attach a tag to him that says, "This is what happens to rustlers." And then they were going to go up to the town of Buffalo, further north in Wyoming, and they were going to just slaughter people. And the Sheriff Red Angus, got word of it, and he said, "No, you're not." He got some people together. The posse came down to where these guys were. These guys heard about it. The invaders heard about it. They went into a ranch called the TA Ranch, and they were surrounded by the posse. And they would have been killed to the last man, hung or killed. But because the governor and the two Wyoming senators were in the cattle business, and they were all part of this, they call up Benjamin Harrison, who's the president, get him out of bed and say, "Hey, there's an insurrection. There's an insurrection up here, and we need federal troops." Well, there just happened to be a fort up at Buffalo, so the federal troops escort these guys down to Cheyenne, and Sheriff Red Angus is saying, no, they're in my jurisdiction. And the commander, Colonel Horn, says, no, I got word from the governor that I'm supposed to bring him to Cheyenne. Well, to make a long story short, they took him back to Cheyenne to stand trial, and they got away with it. They had two really sharp lawyers, one of whom became a U.S. Supreme Court justice. And these guys were sharp enough to get him off the hook. So the Texas gunman basically just drifted back to Texas, and Teschemacher wound up his business, eventually went to Europe. It's kind of interesting because de Billier, his partner.
Well, hang on. So
Yes.
this is all connected to the ranch. So Teschemacher owned the ranch, and he's connected to Teddy Roosevelt. He's led an insurrection in Wyoming that the president had to put down, and his lawyer became a Supreme Court justice. So it's all nexus here at Twin Pine Ranch.
Yeah. Yeah, Twin Pine Ranch is the center of the universe right now. But ironically, Charles, you know this, there were two pines, which enabled them to call it Twin Pine. And one of the previous owners said, no, you should call that Twin Pines. There's two pines. It's Twin Pines. And they said, no, it's different. Let's call it Twin Pine, because there were two. Now there's only one. So my idea about the cover of the book was to put one ponderosa pine on the cover, embossed, so you can actually feel the needles of the tree, and then call it Twin Pine. And then inside, you'd have to figure out, well, why is this Twin Pine? Okay, it's Twin Pine because the other one's gone. So, but there's so many things connected with this ranch, and the more you dig, the more rabbit holes you go down, the more interesting it becomes. And the last thing that relates to Texas is that in 1938, a guy from Texas buys the ranch, and he has it for 7 years, Claude Lewis. And Claude Lewis had a couple of brothers, and they were in Floyd County, Texas, which is, I think, close to the Panhandle. And they got into some trouble with the law. There was something on the ledger that said homicide, attempted homicide. So they went to jail. Two of the brothers went to jail. The other brother that took Twin Pine Ranch didn't go to jail. But the two brothers went to jail, and then they broke out of jail and went downtown, had some drinks, came back to jail, and the official said, okay, you guys are going to Huntsville. So they sent them to the state penitentiary at Huntsville. And one of the guys escaped from Huntsville, and he comes up to Wyoming, and he tells his brothers, he said, hey, there's great ranching opportunities up there. So one of them, Claude Lewis, your former ranch owner, he comes up and he buys the ranch, but he was a wheeler dealer. He wasn't a permanent part of the history. He was just kind of an interim owner. So anyway, there's the connections to Texas. Trail herds during the open range cattle industry, a guy that hires Texas gunmen to come up and kill people, and then a guy from Texas who actually buys the ranch. And digging into this, you have to go into records that you never expected to see.
Yeah,
you know?
So how do you do that? How do you go into those records? What's that process?
Well, you start calling, basically you call people up. Or you go online, go to Google and say, who did such and such at such and such a time? But you basically call up people like at the state office and you say, Cindy, do you have any records on Twin Pine Ranch for such and such a topic? Can you find those for me? Oh, I know what it was. In the Depression era, when everybody was suffering from drought, the water that flows down through the ranch through Cottonwood Creek sinks into a karst formation. Geologists call it a karst formation because there's caves. The water sinks, so the downstream users who have a right to the water, all the water is owned by the state, but you get a right to use that water, they felt that they were getting jacked around because somebody's using up the water. Well, they weren't using up the water where Charles' place is because the water was sinking into a karst cave formation, but they put dye in it and it came out in Nebraska. So the downstream users are saying, we got to do something about this. So during the Depression, they built a tunnel. And the tunnel was about 900 feet long, lined with concrete so that the water could flow down the creek to the downstream users who had a right to use it. And I don't know where I was going with that either.
You know, it just shows you how hard it is to be a rancher, though. You know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Charles. It's a matter of how do you research it. So I asked Cindy, I said, have you got anything on this project? And she goes, I don't know, I'll just type in, so she typed in Cottonwood Creek on her computer and found that there was a board of control that controlled the water of the state engineer's office. And so she said, yeah, I found some stuff. And here in the file was the Board of Control file, a whole list of letters back and forth, back about the problem. You know, I see some opportunity here to build a tunnel. I see there's federal money coming in on a one-time basis through the Work Relief Program. Roosevelt's ABC, you know, all of his alphabet soup agencies, there was some money one time that came in. They said, let's take advantage of it. So they built the tunnel. There's so many things that, I mean, he's got a cave that was lived in by people, well, Charles, maybe 12,000 years ago? Yep. So it's a cave that they have a guy, their geologist is exploring, and with LiDAR, he can go down and explore 20 feet of topsoil. That's the topsoil that's on top of the rock. So there could be anything in the distance of 20 feet that remains, including relics, you know, maybe some Folsom points or bones or what have you.
Yeah, and it's painstaking archaeology, you know, because you have to cut it layer by layer and put it on a shaker table. And the deeper you get, you find Paleolithic artifacts, clay, tablets, or pottery, or what have you. You know, so it's fascinating and fun to do, but it's meticulous, very, very hard work to do.
Yeah, and I think last night you mentioned how, you know, ranches seem to adapt or change. And I think it's interesting because originally that whole part of Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, parts of Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, all the way up into Canada, that was all open range, and there were buffalo on the range. Well, when the U.S. government made it policy to eliminate the buffalo, the food supply for the Native Americans, people came in. When they were building the railroad, they had people shooting. Buffalo Bill bragged that he shot 100 buffalo one day. So they decimated the herds, and by the late 1880s, there were no buffalo left. But people saw the opportunity for cattle. Well, today, Charles has, history is going around in a circle. Charles has buffalo on the ranch.
Yeah, and that's another thing you discover when you start looking into the history of these things, is that history rhymes. So, you know, the buffalo disappear, we bring the buffalo back. A lot of people went out west as prospectors. They just discovered a gargantuan neodymium deposit in Wheatland, just about an hour south of the ranch. So all these people are now coming out to be prospectors and mine. It's not gold and silver, but now it's the gold and silver of our time, rare earth metals that are associated with the battery movement. $24 billion deposit. So history always rhymes, and it's always circular, and there's always something to find. The other cool part about this project is just how much living history there is and how interconnected people were in the West because of how profoundly difficult it was to survive. You know, he mentioned 1885, you had this terrible, terrible storm, all the cattle died. Well, then there was the Great Depression, and then the Knickerbocker crisis happened, and I think it was 1907, which created this huge financial collapse in the U.S. So like every 20, 30 years, something would occur, and there were not strong social institutions to bail people out. So whether you lived or died was how much your neighbors liked you. And in many cases, as you just hear the story, people just take things into their own hands. So they form up a posse, go down to Texas, get some people, or somewhere else, and they go take care of business. And that's really what made the ranchers in the West, and they were tough guys. But because of all those connections, they would not only be able to solve business, but they became, in many cases, leaders. Governors, senators, Supreme Court justices, and they carried that mentality back to Washington, and they carried in many of the big decisions that were actually made in the arc of the 19th and 20th century. So there seems to be this outsized influence that ranchers in the West actually had on the United States as a whole, both in culture and in leadership. And that's another cool part of our project, because we had no idea, at least I didn't. You know, Mark's a professional historian. He's been doing this for a long time. But me, I bought a ranch, and I said, it's beautiful. Look at these pretty trees and this. You know, my family has a history of ranching. It's cool to be part of this. But I couldn't have conceived that small piece of property, 11,000 acres in this big sea of land, would be in the center of so many different things.
Right, right. And I think you talk about how they couldn't get away with things like they did in the old days. Teschenmacher, who was the guy from Harvard, his dad, the reason they had money was because his dad was an early investor in real estate in San Francisco during the gold rush in the late 1840s. He went out, I think he dealt in hogs or something like that, but he came to San Francisco and he started buying up real estate and he became very wealthy. Well, San Francisco in those days was a lawless area, and they formed vigilante
So nothing
committees.
has changed.
Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. So Teschenmacher gets on a vigilante committee, and they hang a few people and run the others out of town. And then another uprising occurs, and he does a very good job at eliminating these criminals as the head of the vigilante group. And they like his job so much that they elect him mayor. And, when he left San Francisco to go to Europe, he was on the boat, and people were at the wharf. They were so happy with him. He was the mayor of San Francisco. He'd gotten rid of these people. Well, his son thought he could do the same thing on the open range. And, I'm sure he thought, well, my dad got rid of these lawless elements. They're not prosecuting them. They're getting away with stuff. It's justified. We're righteous in going up there and getting rid of these guys. And I think he probably thought a little bit about his dad and what his dad had accomplished, because his dad received kudos for getting rid of these people, and he would too, maybe.
Yeah, and my father grew up in Montana. He was out in Miles City and in Big Timber, and they had the exact same mentality. And it's important to understand where these people came from. The Homestead Act basically said, if you come out to Montana, we'll give you a bunch of free land if you survive. The vast majority of people left or did not survive. So the people that were left behind, the survivor's bias there, they were some tough people. So it's very hard to come as an outsider and change things, and you have to find a way to integrate. And that's another thing I had to learn moving into Wyoming, because they carry that same mindset as Montana. You can't buy Wyoming. You can't walk in and say, oh, here's a bunch of money. Okay, guys, let's all do it this way. There's a club, and you're not in it. You have to get in that club, and you have to earn it. And so it's a process. You create some jobs and do various things, and you have to inspire people and give back to the community. And slowly but surely, we're starting to become part of Wyoming's history. Like, we have a clinic up in Gillette, Wyoming, and 34,000 people in Gillette, and 7,000 of them are patients. So 1 out of every 5 people we take care of at our clinic. So that's being part of that community. But the minute you're there, what ends up happening is there's this wave of, hey, now that you're here to do good, let's all work together. So in the cryptocurrency industry, for example, Wyoming's passed 31 laws related to cryptocurrency. Everything from complete new banks, like Speedy Banks, the first full reserve bank in the U.S., to token classification, to a DAO law. So if you guys want to incorporate a business and actually have it be a DAO, you can actually do that in the state of Wyoming, which is pretty remarkable. And what's extraordinary is when you start looking at the history of Wyoming, you notice that they were kind of the first in a lot of things. First to create the limited liability company, first in the nation, I believe, for women's suffrage. There's just so many amazing firsts there for a state that many of us look at as the state we're trying to get out of. When you look at the Oregon Trail, like, all these people were crossing it, and they said, oh man, that Wyoming territory, that's the part that's going to kill you. If the snakes don't kill you, the Indians will, or the weather. You got to get out of there as quickly as you can. But for the people who stay, they tend to be, after you get past that initial wave of who are you and why are you here, get out of my house, let's work together and create some things and build some things. And it's been just a privilege of my career, actually, to get to know the people of Wyoming and just how profoundly special of a state it is.
Well, and the Oregon Trail goes right next to his ranch. I mean, here were 500,000 people, the largest mass migration in human history. 500,000 people go from the Midwest and the East and maybe Europe, and they go up to Oregon, they go out to California for gold, and they go to Salt Lake City. The Mormons establish a community out there in the 1840s. And not all of those people, but nearly all of those people went right by the ranch, up the North Platte River. That was the way you got to the west, as you followed the rivers. And the covered wagons came very close to your property, as you already know.
Yeah, it's cool to actually see the ruts still from the Oregon Trail. So let's talk about the indigenous history, going before the white settlers, like what was the Native American side of the ranch like?
That's what I'm about to find out. I'm going to talk to some Native Americans, and I want to talk to the women. I want to get the women's point of view, because some of them, these matriarchs, have got in their minds, in oral history, they've got a lot of information. So actually, there were a lot of tribes up there. They fought over that country. So it wasn't all like Native Americans are getting along well, just eating the buffalo and all getting along peacefully. They fought each other. They killed each other. The Pawnees fought the Sioux. The Sioux drove out the Shoshones. The Arapahoes were driving out the Crow, who went up to Montana. And others went, the Southern Arapahoes were driven down to Colorado. So it's a mishmash, and God knows what it was like 12,000 years ago, survival of the fittest. But these people knew how to live, they knew how to survive. I look at this place here and I look at Book.io and I think, oh my God, and you read any of the authors that talk about the history of the world and you say, we're living in just the blink of an eye. When you think of the blink of an eye, part of that is the whole history of Charles Ranch. It just boggles your mind.
Yeah, and you can still see evidence of the indigenous people. There's teepee rings in various places, and you can find arrowheads and axe heads, and some of those things may be tens of thousands of years old. And it's so extraordinary because it's just there. No one tells you it's there. And that's a good analogy for life, I think. And life is what you make it, and any place you look, there's any given place. Right here in McKinney, Texas, there's hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, most of which is not recorded. It has to be rediscovered through some sort of means. But if you take the time to rediscover it, you can actually get inspired by it and take something very deeply personal from it.
Well, I think it's interesting that you're interested in woolly mammoths. They call them woolly mammoths. They're Columbian mammoths. So I talked to the head of the anthropology department at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and I said, you guys are working on a mammoth find just north of the ranch. Do you suppose there's any more mammoths on the ranch? And he said, undoubtedly. Because those animals, probably like elk and deer, they went up to the mountains in the summertime where there was not only feed, but they get away from insects. It was cooler. So those woolly mammoths were charging around there, and Charles, you'll have to tell him about woolly mammoths because I think he wants to bring one back, which might make his neighbors a little bit upset if they go through the fences.
I like pissing people off. It's my specialty. And nothing in my life would mean more to me than having a woolly mammoth and it going onto my neighbor's ranch and him coming and complaining about the mammoth in his ranch. And I say, what do you want me to do? It's a mammoth. Just coast there. It's huge. I work with a company that is involved intimately right now in de-extincting mammoths, and they've publicly announced that they have a program and a project, and it's my belief that I think before the end of the decade they'll make some significant progress on that. But there's an inevitability that I'll find a way to get a mammoth into the ranch because that's where they belong. They used to live there. There were large herds that came by, and for whatever reason the megafauna went extinct, but it's the perfect environment for an animal like that. Forest Service is going to get pissed off because mammoths love pushing over trees. It's like their favorite thing in the whole world. But I like pissing those guys off because they don't do anything for wildfires for me. So,
Good way to make friends.
I know. Come on, it's Wyoming. We like our mammoths. But everything that's old is new again. It's that theme that comes in the book again and again. And, it's an example of where I can bring my skills because as much as I play rancher, I'm a technologist and an entrepreneur at my core. I like building things and starting things. And so de-extinction is the next big thing, and it's broader subset synthetic biology. My hope is to bring some of those innovations, whether it be bioluminescence or de-extinction, to the ranch and use it to add something new and exciting, or in some cases bring some old things back. But also to the broader community, it's my hope that this can create more jobs and bring more people to the area, because unfortunately the surrounding area, Platte County and Albany County, the two counties that straddle the ranch, in both cases they're not doing so well. The unemployment rate is quite high and they're losing people every year, and they get older and older. So what happens is the kids leave, the parents stay, the parents keep getting older, there's no replacement kids, and so the town goes from average age 40 to 50 to now it's Catholic priests. They're all They're all like 68. I think that's the average age, right? So unfortunately, that's the problem. It wasn't that thing. It was just the age thing. They're all aging out. You know, there's no replacements coming in. Guys, I'm Catholic too, by the way.
One of the things I have to say, Charles, publicly, I mean, as long as we got the mics, is that, you know, I've always worked under pressure on books and been told what to do, but Charles and J.J. Seiler over here and William have been super. I mean, it's like, you know, we were in conference at one of the cabins up on the ranch, and I said, you know, this could take a while. If you're going to book a coffee table publication, it's going to take a while. And he said, Charles said, I don't care, 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it takes, I want a good product. Nobody ever told me that.
We're used to delays in Cardano, so it's okay.
well, yeah. Well, that's when...
But it's great when we get it done.
Yeah. Well, that's when Cardano had money.
Oh, we're still good. We're okay. Yeah, so yes, we're definitely working. So let's talk about the AI side of it. I promised I'd mention that. So we have a boatload of desk research that's done. And the problem with books is you don't write them in a linear way. It's not like you write chapter 1 and then chapter 2 and chapter 3. You kind of go through this web of discovery, and you say, what about this little thing over here and this thing over here? So you can kind of on a table put out all the chapters, and they have loose coupling with each other, and they all cover, roughly speaking, different eras of the ranch, you know, from Paleolithic or Neolithic, the geography, the First Nations, or the rancher, or the modern era, like the 20th and 21st century. So one of the things I thought would be really cool, because large language models are getting to this state, is that we can, if the context window can get large enough and you have an agentic workflow, you can take all of these different things, and you also can take a lot of related knowledge and help it in stitching together that meta-narrative, the thread that runs throughout the entire book. So that's really going to be my side in contribution to the book, because I'm not a professional historian, and I don't have the patience or time to go and read 14,000 handwritten letters or go and interview people in their 80s and say, hey, remember when you were 6 years old? Tell me all about that. And spend 18 hours kind of going through transcripts and tapes to try to pull out that one or two quote or sentence that links something to another thing. It really is the Lord's work being a historian. I mean, if you look at how meticulous Ron Chernow was when he wrote Washington, and how many letters and things he had to go through, and just to be able to determine what Washington was doing with Sally Fairfax for a single summer, it took 7 years to go through all the records. And he was just also the patience in waiting, because, you know, he said, you call somebody, well, they don't necessarily call you back. Or you send a message, they don't necessarily get back to you tomorrow. Some cases you get a message 6 months later. You're like, oh, okay. And the problem is when you get that, it may change your interpretation of all the other things that you have inside that complex web. It's why history is so hard. But it would be fun to use a large language model to assist in all of this, because then not only can we put all the pieces together, it's probably going to help discover a lot of related things. And the goal is to pull it all together into a really beautiful piece of work that then we can take and deploy here on book and as the first edition. And my hope is to do both a physical and a digital copy as a special edition, and for this to be something mass market. My long-term goal, though, is to inspire people to really take history a little bit more seriously. The reality of ranching in the U.S. is it's dying. And it's dying because what happens is when you get old, two things occur with your ranch, almost always. Sometimes it's rare and it stays completely unadulterated, but usually you give it to your kids or you sell it. And so when you give it to your kids, what do you think it stays together? The ranch used to be 45,000 acres, and then it got split amongst 3 kids, and there was like King Lear. They all hated each other, tried to kill each other, which will be in the book. You know, it's 11,000 is my chunk of it. So just seeing how one generation, it went from 45 to the end of that generation, 11,000 for each chunk. Well, that's the story of almost every ranch, whether it be Texas or Wyoming or Montana or these places. And when they sell it, they seldom sell it to a person who appreciates the past, and oftentimes it gets broken up or if it gets merged together, it's actually owned by corporations. China owns massive tracts of land in the U.S. Bill Gates actually owns more than 1 million acres in the United States right now. He's not exactly using these things for historical preservation. So this lifestyle and this class of asset, which America was founded on, is becoming quite scarce. And so the other hope of the book is for people to fall in love with ranching again and understand what makes it so special, and understand that that's something that probably our grandkids are not going to know much about. You know, we see different stories, like Yellowstone is another example of that, the Dutton Ranch, where people say, oh, wow, look at all that cool stuff. It's a great drama. It's like, well, if they made a show about this ranch, it would be just as entertaining as Yellowstone if you really think about it. I mean, Johnson War would be awesome to put on cinema. So that's the other thing about creatives and partnerships and these types of things. If we live in a creator's economy, if at least one person who reads that says, well, that's really cool, that might inspire that person to then actually make a documentary or a movie or something like that. And then it creates some longevity behind the stories and keeps them alive. Stories only survive as long as there's people alive to tell them, or we care about preserving them. In my office, I have some Babylonian tablets, and one of which is the world's oldest customer complaint. From 1800 BC, Nimrod was complaining about the quality of his copper. He was really pissed off, and he sent it to much peril of the messenger. He had to actually evade being captured and enslaved, and sleep in caves, and got to the city just to deliver a tablet, basically complaining that the copper shipment was not to his satisfaction. 3,800 years later, it's sitting in this office, and I get to see it every day and say, well, Twitter's not so bad. It's great. But I'm so glad that somebody took the time to actually figure out how to read that, because I can't. It's in Akkadian. And a very small group of people are left alive who actually can. So that's the other part about the preservation history, and why I love Book.io so much, to kind of close things up, is that what we do here isn't just about your ownership of things. It's also about the preservation of history itself in an unadulterated form. There's nothing more frustrating as a historian than digging into records of things and knowing you're getting propaganda or not the truth. You run into this if you're a Roman historian. Almost every account that survived is because rich, powerful people decided that that account should survive. Do you think that Cicero or Caesar or Crassus or others had an incentive to tell things in an objective, truthful way? Or do you think they had an incentive to tell things in a way that biased them? And the problem is, if you only get one perspective, you don't really know what happened. So it's insanely important that we actually have archives that have a plurality of opinions, and they're immutable and indestructible, because future generations are going to live in a time where, at a push of a button with AI, you can change truth in a very pervasive way. So this platform isn't just about making it great for me as a publisher, or me as a content creator. It's also about making sure that the human race has something that we've left behind that is historically significant, and we can know who we really were, not who a very small set of people wanted the world to believe that they were. So, Mark, thanks for working with us for the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And I hope you all enjoy the book. We'll try to have it out this year.